Before there was a Tony Soprano who made you root for a killer. Before there was a Walter White who slowly rotted from the inside out on primetime television. There was a leather-jacketed kid from Brooklyn named Vinny Terranova, and a network drama brave enough to spend 10 episodes on a single bad guy instead of wrapping up a new crime every week. Wiseguy premiered on CBS in September of 1987, created by Stephen J. Cannell and Frank Lupo, two guys who had already built careers on shows like The Rockford Files and The A-Team. On paper, it looked like 100 other undercover cop shows from the era. An agent burrows into organized crime, gets close enough to the people he's supposed to be taking down that the line starts to blur, and has to live inside that lie for months at a time instead of closing the case before the credits roll. Ken Wahl played Vinny, the agent slowly getting pulled toward every criminal he was sent to destroy. Jonathan Banks played his handler, Frank McPike, permanently exhausted and one step behind. And Jim Byrnes played lifeguard, the wheelchair-using information man running the whole operation from the shadows. Then there's the guest list. Kevin Spacey years before his career fell apart. Ray Sharkey, Tim Curry, Debbie Harry, and at least one future United States Senator hiding in plain sight as a hate group frontman. So today we're counting down 15 strange, sad, and genuinely surprising facts about Wiseguy. And stick around for number 1, because a wheelchair-bound side character got cast on the single most unbelievable date in the show's history. If you're enjoying the ride, a like and a subscribe helps more than you'd think. Let's go under. Ask almost anyone who half remembers Wiseguy where it came from, and you'll get the same answer. It was based on Donnie Brasco, the true story of FBI agent Joseph Pistone, who spent roughly 6 years undercover inside the Bonanno crime family. It's a great story. It's also math that doesn't work. Wiseguy hit the air in September of 1987. Pistone's memoir, written with Richard Woodley, didn't reach bookstores until 1988, by which point Vinny Terranova had already been on television for months. A show can't lift its premise from a book that hasn't been published yet. What actually happened is less romantic, but more interesting. The broad idea of an agent living inside the mafia long enough to lose track of which life is real had been floating around true crime journalism and mob trial coverage for years before Pistone's book made it famous. Cannell and Lupo grabbed the same cultural moment everyone else did. The Donnie Brasco connection people repeat as fact is really just a coincidence that got lucky enough to sound official. For a long stretch of Wiseguy's home video life, one entire 7-episode run was essentially impossible to legally own. It's called the Dead Dog Records arc, and it aired during the show's 2nd season. Vinny goes undercover as the new owner of a struggling record label, and the storyline pulls in a wild guest cast. Tim Curry as a manipulative music mogul, Debbie Harry as a washed-up singer trying to make a comeback, and Eagles co-founder Glenn Fry playing an undercover agent who's a much better musician than he is an actor. The problem is that a story set inside the record business needed real, licensed music to feel authentic, and licensing music for a home video release is expensive. When Wiseguy started trickling onto DVD in the 2000s, and then got fuller box sets later in that decade, the Dead Dog Records episodes were left out entirely, every single time. Even episodes that did make the cut weren't spared. At least one memorable scene built around a moody blues song had that track swapped out for cheap stock music on the DVD release, leaving the emotional beat of the scene intact, but the actual needle drop gone. The arc stayed effectively unreleased in its original form for well over a decade, until a boutique distributor eventually put out a complete box set restoring the missing music. An entire storyline about the music industry got held hostage by the actual music industry for years. Mel Prophet, the manic, paranoid arms dealer played by Kevin Spacey, appears in roughly a dozen episodes of Wiseguy's first season. He's been gone from the screen for decades. He's never really gone from pop culture. In the early 1990s, comic book writer and artist John Byrne relaunched Marvel's Namor the Submariner and built 2 new characters into the supporting cast, Desmond and Phoebe Mars, twins running a global business empire who are uncomfortably devoted to each other. Byrne has publicly acknowledged that Desmond and Phoebe were heavily inspired by Mel and his sister Susan from Wiseguy. Stephen Cannell also went back to the same well himself. In 1996, his production company made a short-lived Fox drama called Prophet, about a corporate sociopath named Jim Profit, who literally slept in a cardboard box and destroyed rivals for sport. Cannell has said the character's name was a direct callback to Mel Profit, and that the character owed the earlier role a real creative debt. Fox pulled the show after just a handful of episodes, but critics and cult audiences have spent years insisting it was ahead of its time. One relatively minor arc on a CBS show that barely got promoted ended up quietly spawning both a Marvel supporting cast and a cult classic anti-hero. Ken Wahl became the face of Wiseguy almost by accident. Cannell had seen him hold his own opposite Paul Newman in Fort Apache, the Bronx, and offered him the role of Vinny Terranova without a traditional audition. The press ran with the obvious: angle, the cheekbones, the leather jacket, the sexiest man on television coverage, the bodyguards at public appearances. What got far less attention is that one of the show's most acclaimed episodes, White Noise, carries a story credit for Wahl himself. In it, a disgraced former enemy manipulates Vinny's medical file and gets him committed to a psychiatric hospital against his will, where a sedated, hallucinating Vinny is confronted by the ghost of Sonny Steele Grave, demanding to know why his friend let him die. That episode won the 1990 Edgar Award from the Mystery Writers of America, the only Edgar the show ever took home, after 2 earlier nominations came up empty. The trophy technically went to the staff writers who turned Wahl's pitch into a finished script, but the emotional core of the hour, a man forced to finally answer for the friend he betrayed, came from the guy everyone was busy treating like a pinup. Jonathan Banks has been nominated for the Emmy for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Drama Series 6 times. He has lost all 6. The first nomination came in 1989 for playing Frank McPike on Wiseguy, a federal handler running a deep cover operation while quietly falling apart himself. He lost that year to Larry Drake for L.A. Law. Then, 24 years passed. Banks resurfaced as Mike Ehrmantraut on Breaking Bad and picked up a second nomination, then carried the character into Better Call Saul for 4 more. Line the 2 roles up next to each other, and the irony is hard to miss. McPike is a federal agent who stayed honest to a fault. Mike is a former cop who didn't. Otherwise, it's essentially the same performance, a tired, competent older man perpetually cleaning up after a reckless younger one. That run makes Banks the only actor ever nominated in that specific category for 3 different television series. It also ties him with Ed Begley Jr. for the most nominations in the category without a single win. 3 decades of the industry noticing exactly what he was doing and never once handing him the award for it. Cannell's pitch for Wiseguy: spend 8 to 10 episodes building up a single villain before moving on, instead of wrapping a crime every hour, got turned down repeatedly. Not because the writing was bad, but because the structure itself was considered too risky for a network drama. Every network treated the self-contained hour like it was a law of physics. Then Kim LeMasters landed in the top programming job at CBS. Cannell had worked with him before and pitched the idea one more time. According to Cannell's own retelling, LeMasters called it one of the best ideas he'd ever heard and bought it almost immediately. Wiseguy premiered that September. Within a couple of months, LeMasters had been promoted to run all of CBS Entertainment. The format itself proved to be ahead of its time, long-form, arc-driven storytelling built around a rotating cast of villains instead of a case-of-the-week structure, years before that became the standard model for prestige television. And in a strange coda, LeMasters eventually left CBS altogether and later took a job as president of Stephen J. Cannell Productions, meaning the executive who said yes ended up, years later, working for the guy who'd asked. Killing off Sonny Steele Grave 9 episodes into the first season left the writers with a problem they'd created on purpose. How do you follow that? Their answer was to go bigger and considerably stranger. Mel Profit, arms dealer, manic depressive, unnervingly close with his own sister, privately convinced his soul was somehow tied to a crystal, needed an actor who could go somewhere completely unhinged and still hold the screen. They hired Kevin Spacey. At the time, Spacey was a respected New York stage actor. He'd worked opposite Jack Lemmon in a celebrated Broadway run of Long Day's Journey into Night, but television audiences had essentially never seen him. His screen resume up to that point amounted to little more than a blink-and-you-miss-it role as a subway thief in the film Heartburn. Across roughly a dozen episodes, Spacey and co-star Joan Severance played siblings, whose relationship the show made no real effort to keep subtextual, and by most accounts Spacey walked away with the entire arc. Vinny is technically running the operation in story. For long stretches, he's mostly just trying to keep up with Mel. Emmy voters didn't nominate the performance. Years later, looking back with the benefit of hindsight and 2 Oscars on Spacey's shelf, entertainment outlets would rank the snub among the more notable oversights in the awards' history. Season 4 opens with Frank McPike letting himself into Vinny's apartment. The television is on. There's food on the stove. The shower is running. Nobody's home. That's how Wiseguy wrote out Ken Wahl. No farewell mission, no closing scene, just an empty apartment and the unmistakable sense that something has gone badly wrong. McPike eventually delivers a eulogy in which he tells a room of civilians, for the first time, what Vinny actually did for a living, for seasons of maintaining a cover, finally broken at the man's own funeral. Then the show rebuilt itself almost completely. Stephen Bauer stepped in as Michael Santana, a disbarred U.S. attorney recruited into undercover work. Production picked up and relocated from Vancouver to Miami. The organized crime framework shifted from the mob to drug cartels, and even the opening theme was re-recorded with a different arrangement, so the show wouldn't sound like itself anymore. Bauer, whose biggest claim to fame at that point was playing Tony Montana's loyal right-hand man in Scarface, was now on the other side of the badge. Maximilian Schell, an Academy Award winner, signed on as a cartel-linked banker, a genuine Oscar winner, playing a villain of the week on a struggling CBS crime drama. None of it saved the show. CBS scheduled the 4th season on Saturday nights. Ratings collapsed, and production was suspended before the season could finish. Only 8 of the completed episodes actually aired. The final 3 sat unseen until they eventually surfaced on home video years later. In the spring of 1990, an advocacy group called Viewers for Reality Television, which had given Wiseguy several awards over the years and spent seasons encouraging people to watch it, published an account of a conversation its founder had with Ken Wahl about his future on the show. Within hours, Cannell was disputing Wahl's version of events to the press, with paperwork to back up his side. Wahl, in turn, told reporters he'd been dropped from the show against his will and had no intention of returning for a farewell arc, even as his own agent was telling the same reporters that things were being worked out amicably. CBS mostly declined to weigh in at all. 3 seasons of playing a man who lies for a living, and Wahl's own camp couldn't fully agree on how his exit actually happened. During the 2nd season, in the middle of shooting a scene, a director wanted Ken Wahl to walk directly into his own point-of-view shot, meaning he had to step toward a camera dolly that was rolling straight at him. He stepped up. The dolly's will caught his heel and tore his Achilles tendon. According to Wahl's own account, he compared the sound to a champagne cork popping, and when the director asked for another take anyway, he did it again, re-injuring the same leg a second time. He was sidelined for roughly 3 episodes. Rather than right around the absence, the show folded the injury directly into the story. Vinny gets clipped by a taxi and spends part of an episode sidelined for entirely fictional reasons that happen to match a very real one. It's a strange bit of behind-the-scenes trivia on its own, but it also became something more painful. By Wahl's later account, this was the moment his relationship with the show's producer started to sour. He felt his injuries weren't being taken seriously, a grievance that would resurface, far more seriously, a few years later. More than once, someone has tried to bring Wiseguy back from the dead, and only one of those attempts actually made it to air. In 1996, ABC aired a reunion TV movie that brought back Wahl, Banks, and Byrnes, and quietly wrote the entire 4th, Miami-set season out of continuity, on the theory that almost nobody had watched it the first time anyway. The new explanation for Vinny's absence: he'd simply been pulled out of deep cover and reassigned to wiretap surveillance. 6 years off the air, and television's most celebrated undercover agent came back to sit in a van wearing headphones. Reviews were actually strong, but ABC scheduled it directly opposite NBC's biggest night of programming, and almost nobody watched it live. It has never had an official U.S. home video release, and it remains the last time the original cast played these characters together. Years later, a full reboot was reportedly commissioned by a major network with an entirely new premise and no connection to Vinny Terranova at all, a deal that reportedly came with a penalty clause requiring payment whether or not the show ever got made. It never got made, and the network reportedly paid anyway. And more recently, word has circulated about a Wiseguy feature film in development, with Jonathan Banks reportedly attached to reprise Frank McPike. Cannell himself died in 2010, but reports suggest members of his family have continued pushing the project forward. In January of 1981, Ray Sharkey won a Golden Globe for his performance in The Idol Maker, Best Actor, 28 years old, and by most accounts the industry was his to lose. What followed was a well-documented, brutally expensive drug habit, a string of drug-related car accidents severe enough to require eye surgery, and a career that quietly slid from lead roles into supporting ones and then into very little at all. In 1987, Sharkey checked into a rehabilitation program and stayed for roughly 2 months. Within days of completing it, he was cast as Sonny Steelgrave, the warm, funny, dangerously loyal crime boss who anchors the first season of Wiseguy, a character who has no idea he's been betrayed by the man he trusts most. It's widely regarded as the performance that made the show's opening arc work as well as it did. And then, 9 episodes in, the show killed him off anyway, a decision Cannell stuck to over pushback from the network, from Sharkey himself, and reportedly from Wahl, who argued that losing Sharkey would sink the show. Emmy voters never nominated the performance. Entertainment Weekly later ranked it among the more glaring oversights in the awards' history. Sharkey never fully got clear of his addiction. He died of complications from AIDS in June of 1993, at age 40, roughly 2.5 years after Wiseguy went off the air, and only 6 years removed from the best-remembered work of his career. Ken Wahl had wrecked a motorcycle before, badly enough, in 1984, to need 89 stitches in his scalp after an accident on the way to meet with a director about a role that eventually went to Mel Gibson instead. So years later, when Wahl turned up with a visible scar and a new story about another motorcycle crash, almost nobody questioned it. It fit an established pattern. What actually happened, by his own much later account, was that in August of 1992, he fell down a flight of slippery marble stairs at the home of a woman he'd been casually seeing, breaking his neck and severely injuring his spine. That woman, Joan Child, was involved at the time with comedian Rodney Dangerfield, whom she eventually married, and she asked Wahl to keep her name and the real circumstances out of the press. He agreed, and kept telling the motorcycle version of the story to interviewer after interviewer for roughly 12 years, long after most people following the story had already picked it apart. He didn't confirm the real version publicly until 2004. By his own description, the injury cost him roughly 2.5 years relearning to walk, involved surgeries he later called botched, and left him in constant pain that doctors wouldn't adequately treat, a situation he said pushed him toward heavy drinking to cope. He shot the 1996 reunion movie not long afterward, and has said he barely got through production. He never took another acting role. For years before the fall, producers on his own show had reportedly accused him of exaggerating an onset injury to get out of his contract. He wasn't. He then spent the next 12 years quietly inventing the cause of a very real one, to protect someone else's privacy. Set aside every name already mentioned, and Wiseguy's supporting cast is still a genuinely remarkable list of future stars, caught early. Chaz Palminteri turned up in Season 3, years before A Bronx Tale made him a household name. Future Oscar nominee David Strathairn played a small-town sheriff quietly coming apart. Michael Chiklis had a guest spot more than a decade before The Shield. Paul Guilfoyle appeared as a hate group enforcer years before a long run on CSI. Ken Jenkins ran the show's fictional organized crime bureau before running the hospital on Scrubs. Paul McCrane played a volatile record producer years before becoming one of television's most memorable villains on ER. And then there's the one nobody sees coming. A Season 2 arc cast Fred Dalton Thompson as the soft-spoken frontman of a fictional hate group. 6 years later, Fred Thompson was